Greystone Correctional Facility was one of those places the public barely thought about unless a riot made the news. Tucked in a remote corner of the state, it was a small, high-security prison housing men convicted of violent crimes. It wasn't the kind of place anyone associated with romance, let alone scandal. Warden Caroline Mercer had worked at Greystone for nearly a decade, climbing the ranks with quiet tenacity. She was known for her strict professionalism and was respected, if not exactly liked. But beneath her stern exterior, Caroline was worn thin. Long hours, mounting isolation, and the slow erosion of her personal life had left her vulnerable in ways she didn't like to admit. It was during a particularly difficult winter, when staff shortages left her filling in on routine checks, that she crossed paths more often with Vance, an inmate serving 20 years for aggravated assault. Vance was charismatic, sharp-eyed, and quick to offer small courtesies that most inmates never dared. Caroline dismissed him at first, adhering to protocol with icy detachment, but Vance was persistent in subtle ways, never stepping over lines outright, but brushing against them just enough to leave an imprint. Small conversations turned into lingering exchanges. A casual warning about staff misconduct turned into private conversations. One night, after a snowstorm knocked out part of the security system, Caroline found herself alone with Vance longer than she should have been, and the boundary shattered. Over the following months, a clandestine affair unfolded in the dimly lit corners of Greystone's staff areas. Caroline justified it to herself. She was in control. She knew what she was doing. Vance fed that illusion, carefully playing into her need for connection while masking his own intentions. What Caroline didn't know was that Vance had been diagnosed with HIV 6 years earlier, a fact she should have known, but missed, buried in outdated medical records after administrative cutbacks. Vance knew, and he never told her. The affair at first was a series of fleeting touches and secret meetings, always under the cover of work-related excuses. Caroline hated herself for it. The shame gnawed at her. But every time she resolved to cut ties, Vance knew exactly how to draw her back in. He never asked for anything outright. Instead, he played the wounded confidant, the one person who truly saw her amidst the sterile brutality of prison life. Meanwhile, on paper, Caroline remained the model of discipline. Staff meetings continued like clockwork. Reports were filed. Inspections passed without issue. No one at Greystone suspected anything, yet. But cracks had begun to form. Late-night checks grew more frequent without proper documentation. Security logs were quietly altered. One guard, a sharp and ambitious officer named Linda Crow, noticed the inconsistencies and filed an internal memo, questioning procedural irregularities. Caroline intercepted the report before it climbed higher, reprimanding Linda in private under the guise of administrative oversight. Linda left the office furious but wary, sensing something she couldn't yet prove. Outside the administrative walls, Vance's behavior among the inmates also shifted. He became more emboldened, leveraging subtle power over others with the knowledge that he held sway over the warden herself. Rumors began to swirl, nothing concrete, just the kind of low-level suspicion that sticks to walls in places like Greystone. It was during a routine medical screening that the first real danger surfaced. A temporary nurse, unfamiliar with Greystone's internal politics, noted discrepancies between Vance's current health records and his archived file, which indicated a prior diagnosis of HIV. Protocol demanded that the nurse escalate the inconsistency to the health services administrator, but a few casual warnings from older staff about making waves led to hesitation. The nurse delayed reporting the irregularity, unaware of the wider consequences unfolding. Caroline remained oblivious, needing to believe, that her secret could be controlled. But small mistakes accumulated. An inmate, privy to too many private glances between warden and prisoner, quietly began keeping track, waiting for an opportunity to use what he knew. And all the while, Vance waited, patient, calculating, watching the walls around Caroline slowly, inevitably crumble. The walls around Caroline continued to tighten. Linda Crow, frustrated by the warden's dismissal of her concerns, began documenting everything. Missed bed checks, altered duty rosters, suspicious late-night access to inmate areas. She kept her records private, fearing retaliation, but the paper trail grew steadily. Linda didn't know what she was looking at yet, but instinct told her something was seriously wrong. Meanwhile, the temporary nurse, Melissa Tanner, wrestled with her conscience. She understood the risks of ignoring a possible undisclosed HIV infection inside a correctional facility, both to inmates and to staff. After 3 sleepless nights, she finally prepared a formal report detailing the inconsistency, planning to submit it to health services. But before she could, an anonymous note appeared in her locker. "Mind your business. People get hurt otherwise." It was a crude warning, but effective. Melissa froze. She told herself it wasn't her fight, not in a place like Greystone, where loyalty was often to survival, not to procedure. Inside the prison walls, the atmosphere shifted. Vance's fellow inmates treated him with a new kind of wary respect, although few understood why. Those who did suspected he had a sponsor, someone powerful protecting him, and in Greystone, that kind of leverage was dangerous currency. Caroline began to notice it too, small things. Guards hesitating before reprimanding Vance, inmates deferring to him without overt reason. She confronted him one night in the administrative corridor, behind the security office. Voices low, tempers rising. "You're drawing attention," she hissed. Vance smiled, slow and cold. "Maybe you should be more careful, Caroline. After all, you have more to lose." It was the first time he used her first name so openly, without deference. The power dynamic had shifted, and Caroline felt it viscerally. Still, she stayed. Pride, fear, and something more corrosive, shame, locked her into silence. Meanwhile, Linda Crow's independent investigation yielded a discovery: surveillance blind spots. Cameras that should have recorded Caroline's late-night rounds malfunctioned suspiciously often. The IT logs were riddled with maintenance errors, surrounding specific timeframes when Caroline and Vance were unaccounted for. Linda quietly compiled her findings into a personal file. She knew she needed proof, real proof, before escalating her suspicions. Outside Greystone, Caroline's health began to falter. She shrugged it off as stress, headaches, fatigue, lingering flu-like symptoms. She refused to see a doctor, terrified that stepping out of routine would trigger questions she wasn't ready to answer. The infection had already taken root, silently rewriting her future. As winter turned to spring, the atmosphere inside Greystone soured further. Staff turnover increased, disciplinary reports piled up, and rumors whispered through the inmate population like smoke. Caroline buried herself deeper in work, struggling to maintain the facade of authority even as her health declined. Persistent fatigue, swollen glands, and night sweats plagued her, but she pushed through, refusing to acknowledge the growing alarm in the back of her mind. Linda Crow, meanwhile, became methodical. She purchased a cheap burner phone and began photographing documents, surveillance schedules, and any anomalous reports that crossed her desk. She wasn't naive. She knew the risks of exposing a superior, but something about the inconsistencies, the pattern of secrecy, gnawed at her conscience. She wasn't just chasing policy violations anymore. She was chasing something darker. One night, during an unscheduled inspection of the administrative wing, Linda caught a glimpse of Caroline and Vance together. Too close, too familiar. They were gone in seconds, like shadows dissolving into concrete walls. But the image burned into Linda's mind. It was all the confirmation she needed. But she also knew she couldn't act yet. Accusations without proof would destroy her career and probably get her blacklisted from law enforcement entirely. She needed irrefutable evidence, and she needed to move carefully. At the same time, Melissa Tanner, racked with guilt, attempted to refile her report about Vance's medical status. Before she could, she was quietly reassigned. No explanation, no chance to appeal. By the following week, she was gone from Greystone, a cautionary tale to those who thought about asking too many questions. Inside the prison, Vance continued to play his game. With a few well-placed whispers, he set the inmates talking about favoritism, about corruption, never directly mentioning Caroline, but feeding the corrosive rumor mill. Caroline noticed the shift in inmate behavior, but assumed it was general unrest, not realizing Vance was orchestrating it with precision. The mounting tension took its toll. Caroline's judgment faltered. She overlooked key security checks. She signed off on questionable inmate transfers without proper oversight. Slowly, the structural integrity of Greystone itself began to fray. And outside the facility, a deeper danger stirred. Linda reached out to an old acquaintance, a state corrections investigator named Mark DeWitt, using an anonymous tip line. She provided a vague outline: a senior staff member compromised, serious misconduct, potential health violations. Mark DeWitt had a reputation for persistence. Once he smelled blood, he didn't let go easily. For Caroline and Vance, time was beginning to run out, but neither of them realized it yet. Mark DeWitt didn't act immediately. He spent weeks gathering context, pulling inspection reports, reviewing Greystone's disciplinary records, and quietly interviewing former employees, including Melissa Tanner. What he heard alarmed him: stories of misplaced medical files, unexplained staff reassignments, and a warden increasingly described as distracted and erratic. Inside Greystone, Caroline could feel the shift but couldn't pinpoint the cause. She attributed her ongoing fatigue, memory lapses, and sudden weight loss to stress, refusing to entertain darker possibilities. Her fear of exposure was so consuming that the idea of seeking medical help felt more dangerous than the symptoms themselves. Meanwhile, Vance escalated his manipulation. One night, during a clandestine meeting in a maintenance supply room, he slipped a comment that cut deeper than any insult. "You trust me more than you trust your own people now, don't you?" Caroline didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence said everything. At the same time, Linda Crow met discreetly with DeWitt at a diner 40 miles from Greystone. She didn't reveal her identity, not yet, but she brought photocopies of surveillance logs, altered shift reports, and notes about Caroline's late-night access to restricted areas. DeWitt listened carefully, asking few questions but taking copious notes. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Just stop it before it gets worse," Linda said quietly. DeWitt promised nothing but left with a grim set to his jaw. He knew corruption when he smelled it, and he knew that corruption in a prison, where people had limited choices and long memories, always ended ugly. Back inside the facility, Vance's growing influence became impossible to ignore. He no longer needed to hide his smirks during lineup checks. Guards hesitated to discipline him without explicit permission. Even rival inmates treated him with a grudging wariness. Caroline issued half-hearted reprimands, but her authority rang hollow. Every encounter with Vance chipped away at her. She couldn't look him in the eye without remembering the secrets they shared, the risks she could no longer unwind. Then, a new threat emerged. An inmate named Hector Ruiz, small-time drug dealer, skilled gossip, approached Vance with a knowing smile. Hector hinted that he knew about the warden's special treatment and suggested they work something out. Vance smiled back but made no promises. He didn't need Hector's loose tongue spreading trouble. He needed control, absolute, silent control. And in a place like Greystone, there was only one permanent way to guarantee silence. Hector Ruiz didn't waste time. Within days of his quiet exchange with Vance, he was telling carefully selected inmates pieces of what he knew. Enough to stir the pot, but not enough to make himself an immediate target. He bragged about having insurance, a secret he could trade for favors, protection, maybe even an early transfer. Vance listened from the sidelines, seething beneath his calm exterior. He had no intention of letting Ruiz destabilize the delicate balance he had created, not after how much effort it had taken to weave Caroline into his control. Meanwhile, Caroline fought to keep herself upright. The flu-like symptoms worsened. Persistent fevers, unexplained rashes, mouth ulcers she tried to hide behind tight-lipped grimaces. Staff meetings blurred together. She lost track of dates, missed filing deadlines, and began snapping at officers over minor infractions. Linda Crow documented every slip. Outside Greystone, Mark DeWitt's investigation gained traction. Quiet subpoenas were issued for Greystone's surveillance archives and personnel files. DeWitt found troubling irregularities, missing video footage, unexplained maintenance gaps, logs edited hours after initial entry. It was enough to suggest deliberate tampering, though not yet enough to name names. DeWitt planned his next move carefully. If Caroline Mercer was compromised, and the evidence increasingly suggested she was, Cornering her too soon could trigger a cover-up or worse. He needed to move strategically, giving her enough rope to reveal the full extent of the damage. Back inside, Hector Ruiz grew bolder. One afternoon, during yard time, he made a veiled comment about the warden's special late-night visits, within earshot of several inmates and 2 guards. The gossip exploded, crossing the invisible lines between inmate rumor and staff suspicion. Caroline heard about it within hours. She summoned Ruiz to the administrative office, her hands trembling with barely suppressed rage. "You want to explain yourself?" she demanded. Ruiz just smiled, all teeth and insolence. "Maybe we should sit down, talk about my future." It was a direct threat, wrapped in casual language. Caroline's mind spun. Panic, fury, desperation, but she forced herself to stay composed. Ordering Ruiz into solitary without cause would raise more alarms than it would solve. After Ruiz left, Caroline sat alone in the office, staring blankly at the door. For the first time, the weight of what she had done, and what it could cost, became real. Meanwhile, Vance watched from the sidelines. He had allowed Hector too much freedom, and now the problem was growing. If Caroline wouldn't handle it, he would. And in Greystone, solutions to problems had a way of turning final. Hector Ruiz's confidence grew dangerously unchecked. He began to corner guards during shift changes, offering information in exchange for cigarettes, extra yard time, even vague promises of bigger payoffs. He didn't name Caroline directly. He wasn't that stupid, but the implications were clear. The warden was compromised, and he knew enough to destroy her. Caroline received a quiet warning from a senior guard, one loyal enough to still shield her despite everything. "Ruiz is running his mouth," he said bluntly. "It's only a matter of time before he says too much." Panic gripped her throat. She couldn't report Ruiz through official channels. There were no credible charges she could level without exposing herself, and she couldn't ignore him either. Every second he remained free was another second the walls around her weakened. Vance sensed it too. That evening, under the pretext of a maintenance detail, he cornered Caroline in a service hallway. His voice was low, calm, far calmer than Caroline felt. "You're slipping," he said. "People are noticing." "I know," she whispered, shaking. "I can handle Ruiz," Vance continued. "But you have to trust me. Let me do what needs to be done." Caroline recoiled instinctively. Murder was a line she hadn't yet crossed, a final point of no return. But Vance's eyes were steady, patient, full of quiet certainty. "You think this ends with a whisper?" he asked. "It ends with a bang, one way or another." Caroline didn't respond. She didn't say yes. She didn't have to. Meanwhile, Mark DeWitt moved closer to formal action. An internal audit of Greystone's inmate communications uncovered irregularities, encrypted notes, unsanctioned meetings, surveillance gaps coinciding with Vance's movements. DeWitt prepared a formal request for an on-site inspection, but political caution forced him to move slowly. He needed airtight evidence before launching a raid that could implode careers. Back inside, Hector Ruiz unknowingly accelerated his own downfall. During evening yard time, emboldened by the attention he was receiving, he bragged to a cluster of inmates about the deal of a lifetime he was sitting on. 2 days later, the opportunity presented itself. A routine fight staged near the laundry facility, loud enough to distract the nearby guards, left Hector momentarily alone near the rear service corridor. Vance struck fast. No grand confrontation, no shouted threats. A sharpened piece of scrap metal, hidden inside a laundry cart, found its target in a single, brutal motion. One deep, precise stab between the ribs, puncturing Hector's lung and severing an artery. He gasped once, blood bubbling from his lips, and collapsed. The scuffle nearby continued, guards shouting and inmates jeering. But Hector's death was silent, invisible until it was far too late. By the time staff found him minutes later, the scene had been expertly staged to look like a random act of inmate violence, another tragedy in a place already steeped in them. But Caroline knew better. When she stood over Hector's cooling body in the infirmary, looking into his blank, accusing eyes, something inside her cracked irreparably. The official story was wrapped up within 48 hours. Inmate on inmate violence. Nothing out of the ordinary. An internal review blamed lax supervision. cited overcrowding, and recommended disciplinary action against 2 guards, minor scapegoats for a major cover-up. Caroline signed off on the report with a trembling hand, every letter feeling heavier than the last. At the funeral service held within the prison's bare chapel, no family came for Hector Ruiz. His body was claimed by the state, his death slipping quietly into the forgotten statistics of prison life. But Linda Crow wasn't convinced. She noted the strange timing, the rapid resolution, and most disturbingly, the warden's increasingly erratic demeanor. Caroline, once immaculately composed, now appeared pale, sweaty, and distracted, barely maintaining the image of authority. Meanwhile, Daryl Vance solidified his position in the inmate hierarchy. His influence was no longer whispered, but accepted. Guards deferred to him more than was proper. Inmates gave him a wide berth. Caroline saw it happening, saw how one murder had shifted the balance of power, but she felt powerless to intervene. And then came the final blow. Caroline's health collapsed. During a morning security check, she fainted. Full collapse onto the cold, concrete floor of the administrative wing. Paramedics were called, an ambulance dispatched. For the first time in months, Caroline had no choice but to enter a hospital, subject herself to questions, tests, and external eyes. At St. Luke's Hospital, the initial findings were alarming. Severe immunodeficiency, signs of opportunistic infections, weight loss, and systemic inflammation, classic late-stage symptoms. Doctors, concerned about the rapid deterioration, ordered a full panel of tests, including an HIV screen. Caroline sat in the sterile hospital room, staring blankly at the beige walls, as the slow realization began to gnaw at her. She remembered the symptoms she had dismissed, the warnings she had ignored, the risks she had taken. Somewhere deep down, she already knew the truth before the doctor entered the room with the results. Positive. The word fell between them like a gunshot. Caroline barely registered the rest of the conversation. Discussions of treatment, antivirals, prognosis. It all blurred into a single deafening roar in her ears. She was HIV positive, infected, irrevocably changed, and there was only one person who could have done it. Meanwhile, Mark DeWitt received formal approval for an on-site inspection of Greystone Correctional Facility, backed by the State Bureau of Corrections. His team would arrive in 1 week. The countdown had begun. Caroline returned to Greystone, a shell of her former self. Thinner, visibly ill and detached, she floated through the administrative corridors like a ghost no one dared confront. Whispers among the staff grew louder, emboldened by her obvious decline and the increasingly chaotic environment. Linda Crow watched closely, noting everything. Caroline's missed meetings, erratic decisions, random outbursts. She compiled it all into her growing dossier, waiting for the precise moment when everything would collapse, not hoping for it, but recognizing its inevitability. Inside the prison blocks, Daryl Vance solidified his empire. Without Hector Ruiz stirring trouble, Vance operated almost openly, moving contraband, coordinating minor favors, arbitrating inmate disputes. He wasn't just another inmate anymore. He was a king behind the walls. And Caroline, by her silence, had crowned him. Late one evening, Caroline summoned Vance to the administrative wing under the pretense of a disciplinary review. The real reason simmered beneath the surface: rage, betrayal, and a desperate hunger for answers. Behind a locked door, the confrontation unfolded. "You infected me," Caroline said, her voice hollow, mechanical. Vance leaned casually against the wall, unbothered. "You knew the risks," he said quietly. "You just didn't want to see them." "You could have told me," she whispered, her hands trembling. Vance gave a small, humorless laugh. "Would it have changed anything?" Caroline stared at him, at the man she had once allowed herself to trust, realizing the full weight of her naivety. She had given him power. She had made herself a pawn. Vance stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need me now, more than ever. You're not just compromised, you're finished, but I can protect you if you stay loyal." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Caroline said nothing, frozen between fury and helplessness. Meanwhile, outside Greystone's aging perimeter walls, Mark DeWitt finalized his inspection strategy. His team would arrive unannounced, armed with warrants to access surveillance footage, personnel files, and medical records. Quiet arrangements were made with local law enforcement to stand by in case of necessary arrests. DeWitt suspected corruption. What he didn't yet realize was how deep the rot had spread, or how high the stakes had become. At the same time, a slip occurred inside Greystone. An inmate, caught trying to smuggle unauthorized medication, claimed during interrogation that the warden's pet, meaning Vance, had orchestrated the operation. The comment was logged by a junior officer who flagged it in a routine report. The report landed, quietly and by protocol, on Linda Crow's desk. She read it once, then again. Pieces were finally falling into place. The powder keg at Greystone was packed tight, and the fuse had been lit. The morning of the inspection began like any other. A heavy fog rolled over the fields outside Greystone, muffling the sound of the approaching storm. Caroline sat in her office, staring blankly at a stack of unfinished paperwork. She barely noticed when the announcement crackled over the intercom. A state inspection team had arrived at the front gates. Her pulse should have quickened, but she felt nothing. It was as if her mind had already shut down in anticipation of what was coming. Mark DeWitt entered Greystone with a small team of auditors and internal affairs agents. The tension among the staff was immediate and thick. Senior officers whispered behind closed doors. Inmates pressed against cell bars, sensing that something was about to break. Linda Crow didn't hide her satisfaction. She shadowed the inspection team, guiding them casually toward the weak points she had so carefully documented. Camera failures, falsified shift logs, inmate transfers without proper authorization. Everywhere they looked, cracks showed. DeWitt requested an immediate meeting with Warden Mercer. Caroline met him in the administrative conference room, her face a mask of brittle professionalism. DeWitt laid out his findings so far, concerning inconsistencies, missing records, and patterns suggesting staff misconduct. "I'll need access to your personal logs, Warden," DeWitt said, "and I'll require a private interview." Caroline's hands trembled beneath the table. She nodded mechanically, offering no resistance. As DeWitt's team dug deeper, a more troubling picture emerged. Missing medical records, particularly Vance's outdated HIV status, altered surveillance footage, late-night access logs implicating Caroline herself. It wasn't just procedural failures anymore. It was corruption, plain and undeniable. Meanwhile, in the cell blocks, word spread fast. Vance watched the mounting chaos with cool calculation. His web of influence had made him untouchable for months, but the inspection threatened to cut through the protection he had so carefully built. He wasn't going to go down quietly. Late that afternoon, a disturbance broke out in the yard. Two rival groups clashing violently. It was a strategic distraction, timed perfectly as DeWitt's team neared critical evidence. A storage locker linked to Vance's smuggling operations. Officers scrambled to restore order, but Vance's real goal wasn't chaos, it was access. Amid the confusion, one of his loyalists slipped a cell phone into Caroline's office, planting it deep in the bottom drawer beneath official documents. An anonymous message was sent to DeWitt's team. Minutes later, a junior agent found the device during the search. It contained encrypted texts, evidence of illicit communications, inmate favoritism, and possible financial transactions, all pointing squarely at Caroline. When DeWitt was informed, he realized this wasn't just about a warden who lost control. This was criminal conspiracy, and Caroline, sick, cornered, and emotionally hollow, barely protested as she was escorted from her office for formal questioning. Across the prison, Vance watched from his cell, a faint smirk playing on his lips. For him, the game wasn't over. It was just changing. The interrogation room at Greystone was cold, clinical, a space designed for breaking down resistance. Caroline sat stiffly at the table, her eyes unfocused. Across from her, Mark DeWitt laid out the evidence. Altered records, surveillance gaps, suspicious medical omissions, the anonymous phone filled with damning texts. Throughout it all, Caroline barely spoke. She answered procedural questions in a monotone but refused to address anything involving Vance directly. Whether it was loyalty, fear, or simple exhaustion, No one could tell. But DeWitt wasn't easily deterred. He shifted tactics, bringing in Officer Linda Crow to quietly present her own findings: the missing logs, the altered maintenance records, the rumors of late-night rendezvous. Piece by piece, the narrative began to form, one that even Caroline couldn't deny for much longer. Meanwhile, tensions in the prison continued to escalate. Inmates sensed weakness at the top, and in a place like Greystone, weakness invited chaos. Minor assaults spiked. Contraband surfaced at alarming rates. The guards, divided between those still loyal to Caroline and those desperate to save themselves, struggled to maintain control. Vance capitalized on the instability. With Caroline sidelined and DeWitt's team laser-focused on administrative corruption, Vance quietly consolidated his network. New lieutenants rose from the inmate ranks. Bribes flowed to lower-level staff. Secrets were bartered for privileges. Vance was no longer just surviving the storm, he was steering it. Back in the interrogation room, DeWitt decided to press harder. He presented Caroline with Vance's full medical history, the outdated HIV diagnosis deliberately omitted from recent records. He tied it to her medical collapse, the hospitalization, the positive test. "Did you know?" DeWitt asked, his voice quiet but relentless. Caroline's composure cracked. Her hands shook. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall. "No," she whispered. "Not until it was too late." "And you continued to cover for him," DeWitt said, more statement than question. Caroline didn't answer. At that moment, she understood there would be no salvaging her career, no hiding the betrayal, no escaping the consequences. As night fell over Greystone, DeWitt authorized temporary administrative suspension for Warden Caroline Mercer, pending formal charges. She was escorted out of her own facility under armed supervision. An image burned into the memories of every staff member and inmate who watched. And from the upper tier of the cell block, Vance watched too, smiling faintly. For him, it was a victory, but not yet a secure one. He knew DeWitt's investigation was deepening, and eventually, someone would dig far enough to threaten his position. He was already planning his next move, a move that would involve betrayal, sacrifice, and, if necessary, blood. With Caroline gone, Greystone fell into a strange, volatile limbo. An acting warden, a humorless bureaucrat from central office, was appointed to oversee daily operations, but the staff remained tense, suspicious, divided. Some whispered about impending arrests. Others quietly packed personal belongings, prepared to jump ship if things worsened. Mark DeWitt knew he was close. Too many anomalies pointed toward Daryl Vance. Inmate privileges inconsistent with security protocols, unexplained cash flow tied to commissary accounts, and the absence of disciplinary actions that should have been automatic. But hard evidence, the kind that would survive in court, remained elusive. DeWitt increased surveillance, ordering a full sweep of Vance's cell and monitoring all of his communications. What they found was tantalizing but incomplete: coded notes hinting at contraband trades, vague references to staff cooperation. It was enough to justify deeper interrogation, but not enough to arrest. Vance, sensing the net tightening, moved fast. He arranged a meeting with one of his few remaining contacts among the guards, a desperate man named Eric Nolan, drowning in debt and fearing job loss if the investigation widened. Vance promised protection, leverage, survival, if Nolan played his part. The plan was simple and brutal: eliminate potential witnesses, create enough chaos to delay or derail DeWitt's investigation, and if necessary, use violence to send a message that Vance wasn't going down quietly. Meanwhile, Linda Crow, undeterred, continued compiling her evidence, even as the atmosphere around her thickened with fear. She found herself tailed in the parking lot late one night, headlights hovering too close for comfort. Someone had noticed her cooperation with DeWitt. The pressure cooker inside Greystone reached its limit 2 days later. A coordinated riot broke out in Cell Block C, fires set, locks jammed, cameras disabled. DeWitt's team, caught in the middle of the escalating violence, scrambled to secure themselves while trying to protect critical evidence. During the chaos, 2 inmates, both known to have information linking Vance to earlier smuggling operations, were attacked. One was stabbed multiple times in a supply closet. The other was found unconscious with severe head trauma near the exercise yard. Both attacks bore Vance's fingerprints, but proving it would be another matter. And in the heart of the uprising, Vance made his next move. He confronted Eric Nolan in a supply corridor, handing him a homemade weapon, a sharpened screwdriver, and clear instructions. If DeWitt's agents cornered Vance, Nolan was to resolve the problem permanently, kill if necessary. Nolan hesitated, sweat pouring down his face, but fear won out over conscience. Across the facility, DeWitt, realizing the coordinated nature of the violence, ordered a full lockdown. SWAT units were placed on standby. Emergency sirens howled through the night, red lights bathing Greystone in an apocalyptic glow. Vance stood ready, calm amid the chaos he had unleashed. He knew the end was coming. The only question left was how much blood would stain the ground before it arrived. The lockdown turned Greystone into a war zone. Inmates pounded on doors, guards struggled to regain control, and DeWitt's inspection team huddled in the administrative wing, surrounded by improvised barricades of overturned desks and filing cabinets. DeWitt, piecing together the rapid escalation, understood that the violence wasn't random. It was strategic. Someone was trying to bury the investigation, and fast. Linda Crow, barricaded with DeWitt, filled him in on Vance's long-standing influence. His manipulation of Caroline Mercer, the corrupted officers, the missing surveillance footage. It painted a chilling picture. Greystone hadn't been a prison in months. It had been Vance's kingdom. Meanwhile, Eric Nolan stalked the hallways under the cover of the chaos, screwdriver hidden in his jacket sleeve, sweat dripping into his eyes. His orders were clear. Kill DeWitt, sever the investigation at its head, and the rest would collapse in confusion. Nolan found his opportunity when DeWitt stepped into the hallway with 2 agents to reroute power manually to the security server room. They needed access to the backup hard drives, evidence critical to connecting Vance directly to criminal enterprise within the prison. As DeWitt passed a darkened alcove, Nolan sprang forward. The first lunge was clumsy, nerves and guilt turning precision into panic. The screwdriver scraped DeWitt's side, tearing his jacket but missing flesh. DeWitt spun instinctively, knocking Nolan backward with a hard blow to the chest. Chaos exploded. Shouts rang out. Another agent tackled Nolan to the ground, wrenching the weapon from his hand. In seconds, Nolan was restrained, but the attempt was enough. DeWitt's team now had undeniable proof. The corruption reached not only to Caroline Mercer, but into the active staff, into the marrow of Greystone itself. Interrogated under emergency protocol, Nolan crumbled quickly. Between sobs, he gave up everything. Vance's orders, the smuggling operations, the planted evidence, the orchestrated riot. It was the final link DeWitt needed. SWAT teams stormed Greystone that night under DeWitt's direction, cell by cell. Vance was located in his unit, sitting calmly on the edge of his bunk, as if he had expected them. When officers entered, Vance didn't resist. He raised his hands, palms open, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "You're late," he said quietly. They cuffed him and dragged him out under floodlights and shouting inmates. It should have felt like a victory, but DeWitt knew better. No arrest could undo what had already been broken inside Greystone. No amount of paperwork could erase the lives ruined, the careers shattered, the silent, unseen infections that had spread deeper than blood. Across town, Caroline Mercer sat alone in a hospital room, watching the news coverage with empty eyes. Daryl Vance's name was plastered across every screen. She would never escape him. Neither would Greystone. The aftermath stretched over months. Greystone Correctional Facility was placed under direct state control, its staff gutted by firings, resignations, and criminal charges. Investigators uncovered layers of misconduct reaching back years. Falsified reports, abuse of authority, trafficking operations conducted under the very eyes of supposed supervisors. The public demanded heads, and they got them. Several mid- and high-ranking staff members were indicted for conspiracy, obstruction, and aiding criminal enterprises. At the center of it all stood Daryl Vance, calm and indifferent as ever. In court, he refused plea deals. He smiled during hearings, whispered cryptic comments to his defense attorneys, and treated each proceeding like a formality rather than a fight for his life. The prosecutors knew the HIV transmission. The infection of Caroline Mercer couldn't be directly charged as attempted murder under the available evidence. But Vance's broader conspiracy charges, combined with orchestrating violence inside a correctional facility, guaranteed a future of nothing but steel bars and isolation. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The sentence, however, felt hollow to many. Caroline Mercer, once considered a rising star in state corrections, now lived quietly in a modest apartment under a new identity. No charges were ever filed against her, a controversial decision justified by her cooperation during the investigation and her deteriorating health. But the court of public opinion was not forgiving. Her name became synonymous with disgrace. She spent most days in silence, her body weakened by the virus that had forever altered her life, her nights haunted by memories of choices she could never undo. Linda Crow, who had risked her career to bring the truth to light, was promoted after the dust settled. But the victory was bittersweet. The experience left her disillusioned about the very system she had once believed in. A system where corruption didn't grow overnight but was cultivated over years of silence and survival. As for Mark DeWitt, the investigation into Greystone became the case that defined his career. He was hailed as a hero by the media, but remained deeply unsettled. In private moments, he thought often about how close he had come to death in that darkened hallway, how easily everything could have gone differently. He thought about Caroline Mercer too, not with anger but with a heavy sadness. She was both perpetrator and victim, a cautionary tale of what happened when isolation, desperation, and unchecked power collided. Greystone never reopened. The facility remained abandoned, a rotting hulk on the edge of town, overrun with weeds and graffiti, a silent monument to everything that had gone wrong. Sometimes passersby reported seeing movement behind the broken windows, a shadow, a flicker, ghosts, they said. But those who had lived through it knew better. Some wounds never healed, some prisons never closed,